Hey everyone, welcome to Political Radar Echo, 30 minutes of political talk about current topics with panelists from a variety of viewpoints. I'm your host, Cassandra, and this is episode 6.
This is Political Radar Echo with Cassandra, where we cover many political issues affecting our country with a panel of guests from many viewpoints.
Our panelists today are Theno and our first repeat panelist, Lindsay Dorff. Welcome, and welcome back.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about gerrymandering a little bit, but we'll get into that first. I want them to give us a little introduction and why they're here to talk about gerrymandering. So, Dan?
Well, it's a very important topic because it affects a lot of aspects of politics in the United States, and particularly here in Wisconsin. There's a court case going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just last week accepted jurisdiction over a court case impacting how the districts in Wisconsin were gerrymandered in such a fashion as to favor the Republicans over the Democrats quite substantially. This is an issue in every state. It's not just Wisconsin. It's not just the Republicans or the Democrats do it in states they control. So it's a very important topic, and I'm looking forward to getting into the meat of it.
How did you get involved in it? What's your background?
I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then was a high school teacher for 3 years. And then I moved back to my home area up in Ashland and ran for the state Senate. And at age 25, I was elected to the state Senate representing the 8 northwestern counties of Wisconsin. I was the second youngest person in history to be elected to the state Senate. Did that for 4 terms and kept getting reelected, and then finally decided I had enough of politics down in Madison, and I got into politics locally and ran for mayor of my hometown of Ashland, and then went down to Madison after that and ran 2 state agencies and a lot of other things going on. But politically, that's where my background was.
That's amazing. And you ran as a Republican?
I ran as a Republican in a district that was 2-1 Democrat. Mm-hmm. But I'm such a nice guy that I got elected. But nobody expected me to get elected, and I was 25 years old, so it was really a shock when I won the election.
Yeah, that's incredible, and I'd love to have you come back and talk about getting young people involved, too.
That's a topic I would love to talk to you about because I'm trying to do that locally here to get more young people involved in politics and thinking about running for a local office.
Great. So you'll be back.
I'll be back.
Awesome.
Glad to.
All right. Lindsay.
So I'm co-leading a Fair Maps campaign through Citizen Action, and I will be honest, 8 months ago I wasn't super politically active, but it was something that I was starting to pay more attention to, and I became part of the Citizen Action Northeast Wisconsin Organizing Cooperative, and I was on their steering committee. And in January, I saw a news article about this legislation that Senator Dave Hansen was proposing to the Wisconsin legislature that would establish fair maps for Wisconsin. And it was just like a light bulb went off, and I just saw all these different pieces and how this one issue was affecting Wisconsin so negatively. And I know there was a lot of trouble getting traction around this issue before because it tends to be a little bit wonky or technical for a lot of people. But all of a sudden we were in this new political climate where people were so engaged and so active in looking for some way to make a difference. But also I think really trying to reach past some of that partisan divide that I think we felt so acutely in Wisconsin, and this is a topic that addresses that so correctly. So it just seemed like this kind of perfect storm where you had engaged citizens, you had a Supreme Court case that was possibly coming up, so you knew the topic was going to be in the news and be in the media cycle, and then we had this great legislation that we could mobilize people to get behind to make our state a better place. So I was lucky. I reached out and proposed doing this campaign to our organizing cooperative, and they got behind it, and the first big thing we did was a town hall in Green Bay the first week of March, which Dan spoke at, and we were given a lot of caution going into it that people don't typically get excited about this topic. It's hard to understand and it can be a little technical. And we held it at Kavarna, and it was standing room only. We got coverage from 3 different TV stations, and people were really engaged with it. And it was really fun to see that when we had such success at that first event, it actually kicked off these town halls all across the state of Wisconsin. The other citizen action cooperatives across the state got involved. Dan's been driving all over Wisconsin to speak at these town halls. And, we've been getting great media coverage and a lot of involvement. We had a second one in Appleton in April, and it was it was over 140 people attended that. So we're finally, I think, getting the awareness around this issue that people need. I know I'd mentioned to you earlier, I feel like this issue isn't even really a matter of convincing people, because I think most people you talk to about it and you really sit down and go through the facts with, they get it. But the information has been hard to get out there. So I feel like once you can get the information out and share it in a way that people understand, most people tend to be on the side of not wanting partisan politics to be part of our election process. It's just not appropriate. And most Wisconsinites, I think, get behind that.
Right. What is the history on this? How did this start in Wisconsin? I've done some research and I understand it, but I think both of you could explain it a little bit more. My understanding is it started with the census in 2010 and with the Republicans having control. So the legislature is the one who sets up the maps, and that happens around the census.
Right.
Would be.
Let me just give you a brief background on the topic. By the U.S. Constitution, there has to be a census every 10 years. I think we all know that.
Right.
But after the census, every state legislature, every one of the 50 state legislatures, has to redistrict their boundaries for members of Congress, not the U.S. Senate, of course, because each state gets 2 U.S. senators no matter what. But they have to redo the boundaries with population changes for members of Congress and members of the state legislature. And typically, whichever party's in control of the governorship or the state legislature, they write the maps. They draw the maps, and they draw them to favor their party. And it doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican. In Wisconsin, it's Republican, but in Maryland, it's Democrat. Rhode Island has 75 members of their House of Representatives in their state legislature. There's only 12 seats that are Republican. So it's not something that's just Wisconsin. It's not something that's Republican or Democrat. It's a problem throughout the country. Now, let me back up a little bit. In 2000 and previous years, after the census, a party in control will try to take advantage of the other party in drawing districts that favor the election of their members. But the problem that has occurred since 2000, and really it's just a huge problem, between 2000 and 2010, there's a thing that interfered with the process or enabled the process to become more corrupt, and that is technology. By the use of technology, the political parties and political action committees and anybody that wants to spend the money to find out, they can pretty much tell how you're going to vote. They can look at your Facebook page. They can look at what you buy. They can look at what organizations you belong to. And they say, well, I think Cassandra is probably a Democrat, or Cassandra might be leaning Republican. Mm-hmm. And then with that information, they can use the technology in making maps that favor their political party, whichever party is in power. Now, right now, the Republicans are in control of the governorship and the state legislature in Wisconsin. And they drew maps that were so grossly out of proportion that, I mean, if you study the maps, you look at the maps and you say, that doesn't make sense. They packed certain districts with Democrats and then left other districts more Republican. And by drawing the maps, you can control the legislature. And what happened was, after the last census, when reapportionment was done, about 2/3 of the seats of the Wisconsin legislature were heavily Republican or leaning Republican. 1/3 of the seats were Democrat or leaning Democrat. Well, guess what? You look at the makeup of the Wisconsin legislature, the 33 senators and the 99 state representatives in the assembly, 2/3 of the members are Republican. 1/3 are Democrat. And that is because of the way the lines were drawn. Now, the bottom line for me, and I think Lindsay will share this, the bottom line for me as a Republican is that, sure, I would like to see moderate Republicans elected. I'm not a Tea Party Republican. I'd like to see moderate Republicans elected. But the fact of the matter is the system is not fair. The politicians are deciding their voters. They're picking their voters instead of the voters picking the politicians. And that to me is really, really wrong. And what happens is this. When I go around the state and speaking to some of the groups that Lindsay has mentioned, the big problem is the polarization of the political process. When you have real strong Republican districts, they will tend to elect very conservative Republicans. When you have real strong, safe Democrat seats, they will tend to elect very liberal Democrats. Well, what happens is when those very conservative Republicans and those very liberal Democrats come to Madison or they come to Washington, they have nothing to talk about. They have nothing to compromise on. They are so far apart politically that we get into the topic of polarization, the polarization of the political process. And it does exist. It exists in Madison and it exists in Washington. And to me, when you cannot have people, grown people, to sit down, Republicans and Democrats, to compromise for the betterment of Wisconsin or the betterment of the United States, we have a real political problem. And it all boils down to how we're going to redistrict the lines for the Congress and the state legislature every 10 years. And that's the issue.
Right. And I don't think that's what Wisconsinites or across the country, I don't think that's what people want. People keep saying we want everyone to work together. I did come across an article written by Tim Cullen and Dale Schultz, who were majority leaders.
I know them very well,
yeah.
and I'm working with them on this project. In fact.
Yeah, and they're kind of the leaders on this. I'm understanding.
Yeah, they're co-authors of the Fair Election Project.
Right. So they were both majority leaders, one Democrat, one Republican, correct? Right. And one of the things that I wrote down the quote from their article was fighting gerrymandering is about fighting abuse of power, no matter who does it.
Right.
Whether it's Democrat or Republican. So this is something we should all care about, whether we are conservative or liberal. It doesn't matter. This is something we should all care about.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
And to speak to that polarization issue, I think that's what makes me so passionate about it. I feel like we've really had a loss of our Wisconsin identity to a great extent since this has happened. Wisconsin's a purple state, and if you look at any one election, we can flip slightly blue or slightly red from election to election, and that's not what our state looks like right now. I think of Wisconsin, and I think of moderate politics where people who disagree can have reasonable discussions. You can compromise. Compromise, I don't think, used to be a dirty word. It used to be what made politics in Wisconsin work, where... Right. We reached for that middle because that's what people had to do. And so I feel like one of the side effects of that polarization we talked about is that it just makes representatives less responsive to their constituents as well. Because when you have these really extreme districts, one thing that happens is that they're not accountable to their voters anymore. It doesn't come down to that. That power was taken away from voters, and it puts the party in power, whichever party that is. Except that's where things get so extreme, and you have legislation that doesn't represent Wisconsin anymore. It doesn't represent the purple state that we are. And even more so, I think we've all felt that sense of polarization on a personal level as well, and just how much harder it is to have those across the aisle conversations, even with your own friends and family. And I know that's been really hard for me personally, and everybody I talk to feels the same way. We just want our legislature to represent who we are as a state.
Right. And that was something that stood out in this article too, that I will definitely post in the show notes, was both of these gentlemen said when they were representing people in Wisconsin that you were required to come together. You had to come together and find bipartisan solutions to problems. And that's what people want. And it's not happening now because instead of worrying about general elections, people are only worried about getting through the primaries because they know they're going to win. And it also makes them much more beholden to their party over their constituents.
That's absolutely correct.
So,
Absolutely correct.
Yeah, I think that trickles down to us. And what I'm trying to do here is bring people together and let's have face-to-face discussions, because I think that's all trickled down to us as constituents. We don't feel like we can work together. If they can't work together, we can't work together. We feel so strongly we have to defend our beliefs instead of coming together and finding a solution.
Yeah.
And there's really two tracks that this whole issue is going down right now. One, of course, I mentioned before, and that is the Supreme Court case. A group of Democrats and I was part of the press conference when they announced it. I supported them very strongly, as did former Republican State Senator Dale Schultz. The case boils down to wasted votes. If you're a Republican and you live in an 80% Democrat district that has been gerrymandered to only elect a Democrat, or the reverse, of course,
Right.
your vote is wasted. You can vote for the Republican candidate in that 80% Democrat district, but it's not going to mean anything because the election already has been predetermined by how the district is aligned. And that essentially is the case before the Supreme Court. The other track, as Lindsay had mentioned before, was legislation that's pending in Madison by Senator Dave Hansen. And I believe the assembly author is Eric Gingrich, isn't he?
I don't think he's the author, but he signed on to it.
He is a
Yes.
co-author.
Yeah, and you can look those up. I did somewhere I wrote down it's State Assembly or State Bill 13 and Assembly Bill 44 for anyone who wants to look those up.
There's a bill in each house. What those bills would essentially do is take the drawing of the maps out of the hands of the politicians and put it into an independent bipartisan group. It's patterned after a law in our neighboring state of Iowa, a law that works very well. Both political parties in Iowa are satisfied with it because the map making is fair and above board. There's no partisan advantage to be gained. And so the legislation in Madison would be patterned off of Iowa. And that's the direction we hope to go.
And something Lindsay mentioned to me several times is if you take the Iowa model versus our model, for those people who are worried about money, what about that?
Absolutely less expensive. So Iowa's had that model in place for 35 years now, and they haven't had to litigate their maps once since it's been in place. So you compare that to the Wisconsin maps, which between drawing them, which included money for private lawyers to help them draw these set of maps that we've had in 2010.
That was pretty shocking to me when I read that those were drawn by private
attorneys, $2 million worth.
Yes. And then you think of this costly court process that we're going through. I mean, we're heading to the Supreme Court. And I actually just got an updated number last week that it's officially cost us now $2.5 million between drawing and litigating these maps, which is a lot of taxpayer money. I mean, that is not insignificant. So we've spent $2.5 million on our maps so far. And if you look at Iowa, I just looked at an article about this recently. They spent $170,000 on their maps total after the 2010 census, and that included going around the state to hold public hearings about it so everybody got their voice heard, and the entire process was $170,000. So you're looking at them spending less than 10% of what we spent on our own maps. So it saves a ton of money, and it's just simpler, and people feel like they have their voices heard, and it's not exacerbating that partisanship that we have going on in Wisconsin right now.
That's incredible. So the Supreme Court case will be heard in the fall?
Early October.
Yeah, we think October. Yeah.
Okay. And why is it going to the Supreme Court? What is the basis?
Well, the basis is the fact that if you live in a district, as I said before, that is so partisan adverse to what your belief is, your vote doesn't count.
Okay.
And the court, there was an appellate court, a 3-judge appellate court, that sided with the plaintiffs in the case. And in fact, they ordered the state legislature of Wisconsin to redo the maps before the next election, which would be next year. The Supreme Court just last week said, we will take the case. We're not going to force the Wisconsin legislature to redo the maps right now, but we will take the case and look at it and see if there's a way of making the system more fair. We hope that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs in the Wisconsin case, because that will not only affect Wisconsin. When the Supreme Court makes a decision, it affects the entire nation. So if you have states that are gerrymandered in favor of Republicans or states that are gerrymandered in favor of Democrats, they're all going to have to play by the same rules.
Right. And I think I read Illinois is one of the gerrymandered towards Democrats, which...
Yeah, Illinois is gerrymandered towards Democrats. And so they've got the same problem down there. The Republicans have a tough time of getting elected to the legislature because of the way the Illinois legislative districts are.
Yeah.
So it depends on who's in charge of the state legislature at the time, and elections do have consequences.
Yeah, this is really something that we should all be concerned about. So there's a couple defenses that I found. So one of the defenses is in Wisconsin, the Republicans say that their legislative majority is earned and that they just have better candidates and they're better at their message. What would you say to that?
So one of the things that Dan had mentioned earlier is that we're locked into Republicans having about 2/3 of the assembly seats and Democrats having about 1/3 of them. So if you look at election results from 2010, Republicans did get a majority, and so they ended up with the majority of the seats. So at that point, they had 60 of our 99 assembly seats, and Democrats had 39 because Republicans very soundly beat them at the election. So you get to 2012, 2 years later, and there was a swing in the other direction where Democrats got 168,000 more votes than Republicans statewide for the assembly seats. They didn't pick up a single seat. They got 168,000 more votes than Republicans, and Democrats were sitting there with 39 seats, and Republicans were sitting there with 60 of the 99 seats, even though they got 168,000 fewer votes. So I think that in and of itself refutes that, refutes that line of questioning. And you can see in future elections, it swung back in the other direction. Between 2012 and 2014, there were over 400,000 votes that swung back in Republicans' favor. They picked up 3 seats. So they're locked into this position between like 60 and 63 seats, somewhere in there, that no matter what happens with the number of votes that go through, they're just locked into those seats regardless, which means that it's not responsive to voters. Voters' voices aren't being heard, and it's not actually affecting the representation we get at the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a more recent example even. Donald Trump took Wisconsin barely. I mean, it was very, very close.
Right.
But the Republicans Trump took 23 of the 33 state Senate seats. He got a majority in 23 of the 33 state Senate seats just because the way they're configured.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so another defense. The GOP advantage is a product of where Democrats and Republicans live here. Wisconsin is very rural. Much of the state is rural. And then there's some condensed urban areas. So what they're saying is that Democrats all live in these urban areas, and then so much of the state is rural. And that's why they have this.
Each legislator represents about the same number of people, though. I mean, even though they might be more spread out, and they might cover more geographic area, they're still covering the same number of people. And so when you're looking at Democrats getting more votes and still getting significantly fewer seats, that doesn't make sense to me, but I don't know if you have a different...
Well, I would suggest this, that there's... What's happened was the Republicans controlling the legislature packed the Democrat districts that they wanted to pack with Democrat voters to the exclusion of Republicans. Like in urban areas, let me give you an example. Up in the Eau Claire area, there are there's a seat that covers mainly the city of Eau Claire, and then there was a seat that covered the rural parts of around Eau Claire, but part of Eau Claire. Now, and both of those seats, by the way, were held by Democrats. So what they did in redistricting after the 2010 census was they took all of the city of Eau Claire and packed that with Democrats and took that other seat, the more rural seat, out of the city of Eau Claire, making it more Republican. Well, guess what? Eau Claire City elected a Democrat, but the rural area around it elected a Republican. But both those seats were Democrat before.
And I think that's the part of the map that I was talking with Lindsay about, that I looked at two maps side by side of 2004 and I think 2014. I think they were 10 years apart. And the biggest noticeable difference was the north part, how a big chunk of that had been Democrat and suddenly it turned red.
I'll give you an example. To me, this is the worst example of terrible redistricting. Down in the southeastern corner of Wisconsin, Kenosha and Racine counties.
Mm-hmm. That's where I'm
Each county is about the size population-wise to elect its own state senator.
Mm-hmm.
Racine County traditionally elected a Democrat state senator. Kenosha County traditionally elected a Democrat state senator. Well, the rural areas of Kenosha and Racine County are more Republican. The city areas of Racine and Kenosha are more Democrat.
Right.
Well, they thought, how can we pick up a seat here? Well, easy. Instead of having Racine County and Kenosha County each be two separate Senate districts, they combined the cities of Eau Claire, saying Eau Claire, Racine and Kenosha into one Senate district, and the more rural areas of Racine and Kenosha counties into another district. They split them east-west instead of north-south. And as a result, the seat that contains the cities of Racine and Kenosha continued to elect a Democrat,
right.
But that rural area of those two counties all of a sudden is a Republican seat, and a Republican state senator is serving in Madison. So just by changing the lines in Racine and Kenosha County, the Republicans were able to pick up a Senate seat.
Wow.
With no problem.
That's crazy. I grew up in Racine, so that's really interesting to me how they flipped that. So one more quickly. Redistricting is a political process, and to the winner go the spoils. That's another argument.
And you know what? I think to a certain extent that was the mindset before 2010, when there was a certain amount of gerrymandering that was expected, but they couldn't do it with the precision that they can now do to technology, that it was completely insurmountable. And I mean, I think if you look at, between 2000 and 2010, the state legislature could go in either direction. And we still had urban centers like Milwaukee and Madison at that point too. But sometimes Democrats were in control and sometimes Republicans were in control. We're looking at a completely different ballgame in terms of how precisely they can do it right now with technology. And I heard an analogy recently that in 2000, the technology was what you'd compare to a good car. And then by 2010, it was like a rocket ship. So, it's one thing to have that mindset when if a party gets out there and gets better ideas out there, they still have a chance at being competitive, and just completely taking voters out of the picture in terms of who has control. And quite frankly, to me, it's not about the political parties. It's the loss of control for voters, because it's not about the parties. It's about the people that are supposed to be represented by our state assembly people and our state senators, and we no longer are because our voices can't be heard through voting. And that's just a huge issue for democracy. Take the parties out of it. It's a democracy issue.
Yep. I absolutely agree. So, unfortunately, we are out of time already, and I think we could go on forever about this. So I would really like you to come back once we get into the Supreme Court and how that goes and everything, I'd really love to have both of you come back and we can look back on that and where it goes from there.
Okay.
And any final thoughts? How can we reach you? How can we get involved? How can people
Absolutely.
involved in this process?
So one thing we're encouraging people to do is reach out to their state assembly person and their state senator and let them know that they want nonpartisan redistricting, or we've been calling it fair maps because nonpartisan redistricting tends to sound a little technical. But let them know that you support fair maps, that you support that SB 13, AB 44 legislation. And then right now what's happening is that legislation is stuck in committee because it's not really in the best interest of the committee leaders to move it forward. So you can also reach out to the committee leaders as well and let them know that you'd like to hear and have a public hearing about this legislation. So I believe in the Senate, it is Devin LeMahieu from the Sheboygan area who is the head of the committee that's holding this up right now. So you can feel free to give him a call. And then it's Kathy Bernier, I believe, is the head of the assembly committee where this is being held up. So please feel free to give any of them phone calls. It's, some people could say it's not just your right as a citizen, it's actually your duty if you think that this is wrong. So definitely make your voices heard.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Just that, some people might think that this is kind of a dull topic. We're finding out that people across Wisconsin, when I go around and give talks on this particular subject, they are fired up about it. It is a very important issue, and people are tired of the polarization of the political process. We need to solve this problem to bring democracy to where it should be.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. Well, thank you both so much. I look forward to having you back and continuing the discussion. So that ends Political Radar Echo, episode 6. Thank you again for coming on. For show notes, go to politicalradarecho.com/6, and I'll include a lot of the articles and stuff that we've discussed and any other information that you would like to share. Let me know and I can add that to the show notes. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications. For more great political content, be sure to check out Political Radar Pulse. And if you'd like to support the show, you can like us on Facebook and join the Political Radar Echo community on Facebook. You can buy shirts and other merchandise at politicalradar.com/shop. A little word about the Political Radar Echo community group. Guys, let's behave. Let's be kind to each other. Let's make sure we're talking about issues, not each other. Sorry to have to pull out my teacher voice, but I am recovering from a health issue, and I'm getting a little frustrated with some of you. So please just behave and be kind to each other. And again, attack the issues, not each other.
Right.
So, all right. Thank you.
Thanks for watching Political Radar Echo. To ensure that you'll never miss an episode, subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. To check out more episodes of Political Radar Echo, visit politicalradarecho.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.